mute the microphone.
All right. So good. Well, morning, everyone. And so my name is Tuukka Petaja, and I'm a professor at Experimental Atmospheric Sciences at the Institute of Atmospheric and Earth System Research. And I will briefly introduce you to the topic of SMER observations, and particularly in connection with atmospheric composition. And I'll show you a few examples from here and there, what are the benefits of comprehensive observations. And if you have questions during the presentation, you can write them in the chat, or I guess you can also raise hand. Maybe Alexander, you can then not give me a heads up if there's a question, because I cannot at the same time follow the all right. So the SMER observations, the context is this. So this is what we do, for example, in our Hytiala station in Finland, and the SMER stands for Station for Measuring Ecosystem Atmosphere Relations. And the key in these kind of comprehensive ground-based observations is to capture the different fluxes between the atmosphere and the Earth surface. So how the CO2 is uptaken by the boreal forest, or how the volatile organic compounds are emitted. So the smell of the forest is emitted from the trees, and that influences atmospheric chemistry, for example. And in these kind of comprehensive observation stations, we are able to monitor these interactions between the atmosphere and the Earth surface. So, but it's not only greenhouse gases, but it's also reactive gases, aerosol particles, heat and momentum, for example, and water vapor and water, liquid water as well. For example, in Hytiala, we try to also close the budgets in a way that we understand what is coming into the biosphere in terms of rainfall, how much of water is flowing out from the system, and how much is evaporating from the forest. And capturing these fluxes and flows is the key in these comprehensive observations. And to do this properly, the scientific team includes physicists, atmospheric scientists, forest ecologists, chemists, mathematicians, etc. So it also connects to multidisciplinary environmental science. And this kind of Hytiala observation sites, they are connected to many European wide or global wide observation networks, and there will be a follow-up lecture in the afternoon about the research infrastructure. So I will not go into much detail on these acronyms, ACTRIS, ICOS, etc. But at this point, it's enough that you know that these are networks of observations that try to harmonize the observations. So one of the key thing in situ observations, of course, is to do good measurements, but also do the measurements in a way that you can compare to measurements that are done, for example, in different parts of Europe. Right, and this kind of SMER station can be. It doesn't really matter what is the environment where the measurements are. I will show a few examples with where this kind of SMER observation station is in urban area in China, and so the measurement location dictates the scientific questions that we are able to answer with the data. And few pictures. So these are the SMER stations, or set of SMER stations, and in the background you see SMER 2 station in Hytiala. We have 127 meter mast with meteorological and atmospheric composition measurements And then another tower here at 35 meters, where we have more complex instrumentation above the tree line, and then we have measurements also at the ground level. The first SMER station was established in Värriö in eastern Lapland in the 1990s, so 30 years ago already. And that location is rather close to the industrial and mining and other activities in Kola Peninsula. And the initial concern was the acid rain and the sulfate emissions from the smelters. And we were, or the Finnish government was worried about forest damage by industrial emissions, and then we started measurements of sulfur dioxide and aerosol particles in Värriö to look at the impact of acidification to the forest. And in 1995 we expanded the network to Hyytiälä. And then subsequently we have several other stations. So SMER 3 in Helsinki, looking at the urban air quality and urban surface interactions with the atmosphere. There's an activity in Puijo Tower, and this is particularly a place where aerosol cloud interactions can be studied, since the tower is occasionally inside the cloud. So you can measure separately the cloud properties and the interstitial aerosol and trace gas concentrations inside the clouds. Then we've collaborated with Tartu University and established already more than 10 years ago SMER Estonia in Järvselja. So this is a hemiboreal environment which has the similar kind of tall tower and aerosol and greenhouse gas and ecosystem observations. And then two urban activities, one in Sorpes in Nanjing, where we started also in 20 years ago, and then very recently in Beijing, starting 2018. So these city observations provide a contrast against the boreal and biospherically dominated environments, and then allows very nicely the comparative studies between the anthropogenically dominated and biogenically dominated environments. Okay, so for the SMER 2, we have several instrumented cottages and containers with instruments. We have the towers, as I showed you. Then we have observations on top of a lake. So we can also look at the for example, dissolved organic matter in the lake water, and then greenhouse gas budgets, for example, on the lakes, and then also on top of the peatland. So and particular compound of interest there is methane. So how much methane is emitted by the decomposing peatlands. Okay, a little bit more about aerosol particles. So these are aerosol particles are objects that float in the air. They are too small to be very effectively pulled down by gravity. They can be solid or liquid droplets, and they come in different sizes and different chemical composition. And in a contrast, we have their hair, which is 50 micrograms in diameter, and then we have here particle PM10, which is mass concentration of smaller than 10 micrometers in diameter. And then going into more detail, we have PM2.5, which is still rather large in my opinion, but constitutes quite a lot of the aerosol mass. And then the aerosols that influence climate most are actually even smaller. So in the size of from few nanometers up to several hundred nanometers in diameter. So this submicron aerosol size distribution is very important parameter for climate, and that's one of the main areas of study that we do in Hyytiälä. And in contrast, I also show here these biological objects. So the COVID virus is 120 nanometers in diameter. So it's in the size range of accumulation mode aerosol particles. So one of the key results we started to obtain in Hyytiälä was we started to see that the size distribution of aerosol particles evolved in a very specific way during the day. So here we have 1 day of measurement starting from midnight to midnight. This is the time in springtime in Hyytiälä. And so time is on the x-axis, y-axis is the aerosol size, so diameter, and we start here from 3 nanometers. This is 10 nanometers. And ending up in 1 micrometer. So these are all smaller than 1 micrometer in diameter. So we have, and the color tells you the concentration at given time, at given size. And what we see is that we have a lot of red colors before noon starting, and this is so-called aerosol formation or gas to particle conversion. And we actually have a set of vapors that start to cluster and form new aerosol particles, and these aerosol particles grow in size during the day and end up into sizes of tens of nanometers, where they actually are already large enough to contribute to, for example, they are able to activate as cloud droplets and then therefore influence the aerosol or the cloud properties. And the starting point in the 30 years ago was that this was not anticipated that in the boreal environment there would be a source of new aerosol particles, and this was a big mystery. And we started to look at what are the important trace gases that lead to formation of aerosol particles. What is the chemical composition of these aerosol particles, and how does that composition evolve over time? And what are the different vapors responsible for the formation and growth? So that has been very key to our understanding and in our studies to look at what happens in the boreal environment. And here's just another figure of charged aerosol clusters, so atmospheric ions. So these actually start from 1 nanometer and go to 40 nanometers in diameter, and we see the same thing with different instruments, that these ion clusters are forming during daytime and they grow in size. So that's the so-called a process that forms new aerosol particles from gas phase precursors. In a larger perspective, what we found out is that we have these feedbacks and connections between atmospheric composition. So we have, for example, here the biosphere is photosynthesizing, so taking up CO2, and as a side product they are emitting these biogenic volatile organic compounds, BVOCs, which are, for example, monoterpenes, and these monoterpenes contribute to the gas to particle conversion or these new particle formation events, forming and growing the aerosol particles, and then this leads to changes in aerosol size distribution, and that increases the existing aerosol particles, that alters the radiative transfer in the atmosphere, and this kind of connection actually increases the cross-primary production, so the photosynthesis. And this kind of feedback loop is something that feeds itself in a way that the increased CO2 concentration by anthropogenic activity, so the climate change drivers, actually increase the cross-primary production and the biospheric photosynthesis, which actually provide a feedback that increases the photosynthesis even further. So this is kind of a process that tries to actually tackle the climate change, because this is a process. The lower loop here is trying to actually cool down the climate, and we've verified that this kind of process takes place in the boreal forest based on long-term observations from the SMEAR station. The top feedback here is again starting from the fact that we have higher CO2 concentration, elevated VOC emissions, elevated aerosol formation, but also there's an increase in cloud condensation nuclei, so the aerosols that are able to act as cloud condensation nuclei, and they actually change the albedo of clouds, making them wider and more reflective, and this cools down the temperature. And this is another these kind of feedback loops that the biosphere is trying to keep the temperatures the same in the boreal environment. So understanding these feedback mechanisms helps us to hopefully slow down the climate change. So these are verified against the 30 years of observations in Hyytiälä. But going back to really basics in terms of how the aerosol particles are formed, after 20 decades of research, we have really understood that there's several processes in the initial steps of where the aerosol particles are forming. So we have these BVOCs and other vapors are reacting. There's atmospheric chemistry going on, but most of these vapors do not have anything to do with the formation of aerosol particles. But given enough atmospheric processing and atmospheric chemistry, transforming the biogenic emissions and other vapors into condensable form, these trace gases start to actually cluster with each other, and instead of breaking those clusters, those clusters start to stick together, and the key components there are sulfuric acids and amines, for example. So a very strong acid, sulfuric acid, and a very strong base, amine. The other important compounds are, for example, sulfuric acid and ammonia. So acid-based chemistry, and so these clusters tend to stick together instead of breaking apart, and these clusters then invite more and more also the organic vapors to partition into the aerosol phase, and allowing the organic vapors or accommodate the organic vapors into the clusters makes the growth rather fast. And this happens in the size range of 2 nanometers onward, and you can see that after the initial growth, the growth is rather rapid, and you can see that one thing to note is that this is a logarithmic scale. So when the diameter is doubling, the volume is increasing by a factor of 8. So you need a lot of condensable vapors to grow these nanometer-sized particles into tens or even 100 nanometer in size. So based on Hytiala observations, we have understood the key processes going from trace gas concentrations and trace gas emissions into formation of aerosol particles. And what we see is that we start with gas molecules, initiate cluster formation, and these clusters grow into aerosol particles. And we need different types of instrumentation to understand the whole picture. So we need mass spectrometric techniques to understand the chemical identity of different volatile organic compounds, so sulfuric acid, and their concentrations. Then we need aerosol instrumentation to look at the number concentration of these forming clusters, and other instruments to look at how this size distribution is evolving over time. So we need different techniques at different phases of the process. And this is what we did. We decreased or improved the detection efficiency of aerosol instruments from in 1995 there was an ultrafine instrument that was able to detect aerosol particles down to 3 nanometers, and it took us approximately 20 years to lower that detection limit to the critical size of 1 nanometer. And one of the key instruments was particle size magnifier, which was commercialized by Air Modus company. And that relies on dual condensation. So first activating the smallest aerosol particles with diethylene glycol, and then with water or N-butanol, and then detecting the concentrations. And the chemical measurements, we implemented so-called chemical ionization atmospheric pressure interface time of flight mass spectrometer, so the CI-APITOF, and that is a high resolution mass spectrometer that can give us the chemical identity of trace gases and small clusters. This technique was commercialized by Kärsä company. So with these two techniques, we are able to cover the measurements from trace gases into aerosol particles, which was the critical gap in several years ago. And the results, when we look at the growth of aerosol particles, so here we have the very small 1 nanometer clusters, and here we have the aerosol particles that are readily activated as cloud droplets, so at 100 nanometer, and then the different or the colors tell us what are the compounds that are critical for at which state of aerosol size distribution development. So initially, sulfuric acid is very important. Sulfuric acid in the atmosphere is formed, for example, from oxidation of SO2 after several steps. SO2 emitted by, for example, volcanoes or anthropogenic emissions, sulfur in the fuel, for example, that will lead to formation of sulfuric acid. That's one of the acidifying compounds in the atmosphere. So sulfuric acid is important at the beginning, but typically the sulfuric acid concentration is small in the atmosphere, and it cannot. There's just not enough sulfuric acid to grow these aerosol particles to larger sizes. So we need other compounds. So the basic compounds, amines and ammonia, are balancing the sulfuric acid. So acid and bases go nicely together, but the main bulk of the growth is coming from organic compounds which are oxidized in the atmosphere. So these are transformed biogenic VOCs or anthropogenic VOCs that grow the particles then to the CCN sizes. And then a question to Alexander is that how much time do I have? Okay, well, 11:30 according to my schedule, so I'll keep on going. When we look at the recent understandings on how aerosol particles are forming, it's key to understand that we always have two types of sources for these trace gases that lead to aerosol formation. So we have the anthropogenic sources that includes sulfate and also NOx and organic anthropogenic VOCs. And then we have the biogenic sources, which are, for example, monoterpenes or isoprene. And then there's actually an interaction between these two sources that lead to formation of aerosol particles, and depending on the location where we do the measurements, the contribution from biogenic sources and anthropogenic sources are varying, and that's one of the reasons why we have these smear stations in different environments, not only in the boreal environment but also in different urban environments. And then these trace gases form aerosol particles with different volatilities and different compositions, and then they influence, for example, the aerosol particle population that is able to act as cloud condensation nuclei. They also change the optical properties of the atmosphere and also influence the properties of clouds. And we need laboratory studies, modeling, and field studies to understand the full scale of how the trace gases are evolving into aerosol particles. Okay, I will not talk about this anymore. Moving along. So in addition to long-term observations at smear stations, we also do different types of field experiments in moving platforms, for example, in the Zeppelin, or on a ship, or in the Trans-Siberian Railway. So this is Troika measurements, where we measured from Moscow to Vladivostok and back. And then we do measurements in the Greenland and in high alpine and regions, as well as in the urban environments. One nice location where we have studied new particle formation is Mace Head in Ireland, and we looked at here is again a gas to particle conversion happening at Mace Head, but it looks a little bit different than in Hytiala. So we have very intensive clustering, and then we have the growth later on, and actually we can identify two processes. So this intensive clustering is caused by exposed seaweed on the seashore, emitting halogens and initiating halogen chemistry. And these halogens are another important compound that can make small aerosol particles, and this is specific for the coastal environments. And then the growth here is more like similar to Hytiala observation, so a continental growth event, which also is dominated by organic vapors. And our mass spectrometer was in Mace Head for several years ago, and we were able to identify these clusters. So actually this HIO3 is clustering in these events, and we can follow the clustering one molecule at a time. So the composition of clusters is evolving over time when more and more of these HIO3 is subsequently added to the clusters. So this is by collisions of these clusters, and the mass spectrometer is able to then tell us the identity of these clusters. There's also some sulfuric acid and ammonia or nitrogen compounds at the beginning, but the larger clusters are almost completely made out of this halogen iodide clusters. One of the observation sites where we did aerosol measurements is also the Amazon. And the Amazon is very particular place where there's a lot of VOC emissions, but they are a little bit different than the boreal forest, so mostly isoprene dominated. And there we did aerosol measurements on the aircraft, and we were able to actually associate the in situ detected nanoparticles and explain that these the measurements come, or these aerosol particles are diluted and brought down from higher up in the atmosphere into the with the rain. So the aerosol concentration in the Amazon region is actually sustained by the rain and the aerosol particles that are brought down from higher up. And then one example from the lab experiment. So this is in the cloud experiment in CERN, and we can simulate in a controlled environment formation of nano clusters and their growth like this. So this is looking at negative ions, and we see the same kind of feature that we have clustering and initial growth and then continued growth towards larger sizes. And the mass spectrometers are able to give us molecule by molecule this clustering, and we can control the clustering by feeding different types of precursors into the chamber. And this experiment was done with sulfuric acid and ammonia. So the mass spectrometer shows up with clusters of sulfuric acid. So sulfuric acid monomer, sulfuric acid dimer, sulfuric acid trimer, and then we start to have also signals of ammonia attaching to these tetramer of sulfuric acid. But there's also one challenge is that there's probably ammonia in these smallest clusters as well, but they are evaporating in the mass spectrometer. So there's something also to be considered, that it's very difficult to make measurements without changing sometimes the chemical composition of these small clusters. Okay, I will not go into this one. According to my schedule, I have 12 minutes left, so I'll skip a few slides. So these are just commercial instruments originating from our research, which can be implemented in different applications, not only atmospheric side, but also security and for example, engine emissions. The key thing that then I briefly talk about is the what happens to aerosol particles when they grow in larger sizes. So here we have few days of consecutive new particle formation events, and these aerosol particles, for example, starting 23rd of April, you can see that these particles continue to grow over several days, and they reach 100 nanometers in diameter. And then one of the key questions in one of our campaigns in Hyytiälä was that actually, do these aerosol particles have an influence on properties of clouds? And so we actually we hosted U.S. Department of Energy laboratory in Hyytiälä for 8 months, and we did a lot of ground-based in situ observations. But the American contribution was different lidar and radar technologies that helped us to provide vertical aerosol data, so how the aerosol particles are varying as a function of height above the boreal forest, so going beyond the surface layer, extending up to 10 kilometers. So and also the radars were able to give us the properties of clouds, for example, and we also improved or included satellite analysis, what Larissa was talking about earlier, to look at the properties of clouds around Hyytiälä after these new particle formation events. And actually, this connects to even in a larger scale to understand what happens to the biospheric emissions, how they are mixed within the boundary layer, how they influence atmospheric chemistry, and based on the new particle formation analysis, we know that these biogenic VOCs are, and their oxidized forms are very key to contributing to aerosol dynamics, and we actually show that there's a connection from aerosols to CCN concentrations and even to precipitation. And the starting point for the analysis that we did is an old paper by Peter Tunved et al., where they looked at how the air mass or atmospheric aerosol concentrations are varying as a function of time. How long does it take for the aerosols or the air mass trajectories to reach the site? So how long are these air masses over the biosphere before they reach our observation site? And already in 2006, they did the analysis showing that when we have slow-moving air masses and the time over the boreal forest is long, then the size distribution and the mass of aerosol population tends to be higher than during the cases when we have very rapidly moving synoptic weather systems and very short period of time when the certain air parcels are influenced by the biogenic emissions. So we saw this connection earlier, but with the added observation capacity by the ARM mobile facility, we were able to show that aerosol particles are really composed of more and more organic matter when in the slow moving air masses, and we actually were able to show the changes in air cloud properties. And just a few days ago, the paper was accepted in Nature Geoscience. Unfortunately, I cannot show the results at the moment since they are under embargo, but you have to take my word for it. Okay, we talked about the feedbacks already, but then quickly showing some development in China. So this is from Beijing, and we started in November 2017 with a clean, well, not clean, but empty lab, and in a few months the space was filled with atmospheric instruments to measure trace gas concentrations, volatile organic compounds, aerosol size distributions here as well, and also the high resolution mass spectrometry. And the key thing in these urban environments is that we have similar processes, so formation of aerosol particles from trace gases, but the chemical cocktail is different. So the chemical composition is different in the clusters, and we identified, for example, the role of amines to be critical in the Chinese megacity. But the process of gas to particle conversion is happening also in China, but the composition of clusters is different. And we are also now looking at these kind of urban megacity new particle formation events, how they grow into larger aerosol particles, and how they actually contribute to very dramatic poor air quality episodes. So these haze episodes. So this also includes heterogeneous chemistry inside the aerosol particles themselves, but this is also something that we are at the moment working on. The benefit of having this kind of smear observations is also that we can contribute to spatial variability of air quality by providing reference instrumentation where small low-cost sensors can connect to and calibrate their signals. This, for example, allows to expand the single point, very precise smear type observations into the neighborhood or into a region. And this can be, for example, used in city planning or health and well-being analysis. And we have all, for example, in Helsinki, implemented so-called green path. So you can find a route from your location to the other side of the city where you are less exposed to air pollution. And so including optimizing in terms of personal exposure. Of course, the air quality in Helsinki is typically very good, but when this is applied to a city with high air quality problems, this can actually reduce the impacts of poor air quality to people. All right, I'll leave my main message there, and I'm ready for questions. So we need more, we need observations, we need development of tools and active collaboration, and then we are able to tackle the grant challenges. So thanks for your attention. Is there any questions?